Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this public discourse webinar on the book, The Problem of Atheism, written by Augusto del Noce. We're joined this evening by Carlo Lancellotti, who's the translator of the book. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm RJ Snell, editor-in-chief of The Public Discourse, which, of course, you can see at thepublicdiscourse.com. It's the journal of the Witherspoon Institute. You can read it, of course, online daily or receive either a daily or a weekly email subscription to the journal. It's always free, of course, and we remain committed to substantial and we hope calm and charitable engagements with the social, moral, and political issues of our day. Augusto del Noce, 1910 through 1989, is often referred to as one of Italy's most eminent 20th century historian of philosophy and indeed of political philosophy. But until fairly recently, his work was not widely known in the English-speaking world, in part because there had been very little, really, if any, translations available. That is, until 2014, when Carlo released his translation of The Crisis of Modernity, which of the Del Noce I've read, it remains my favorite and one that I return to the most and have learned a great deal from. Followed by The Age of Secularization in 2017. And now at what must have required enormous labor, The Problem of Atheism, which weighs in at about 500 pages and is almost equal in length to the two earlier volumes combined. Del Noce, in my view, is a master historian of ideas, a thinker from whom brilliant insights pour out one after the other, sometimes in wild profusion. He's not an easy read, and the structure, I think particularly of this book, The Problem of Atheism, can be quite challenging to follow, as to his references to people who are at least unfamiliar to me, the inner workings of Marxist thought, Italian philosophers and scholars that I haven't studied, sometimes figures that are not usually studied in English-speaking philosophy programs. But he's also challenging because he exhibits what I take to be a deeply prescient sense of where things will go and why in society and culture, but not in the usual hackneyed ways. He takes views that are unfamiliar to me in many times, and yet reads and takes that I return to and think about with some repetition because there's just so much there. Here at Witherspoon, we teach selected essays of his, Del Noce's, every year during the summer seminars. Public Discourse has published essays on Del Noce or utilizing his work, and I, for one, resonate very deeply with the kind of philosophy that he does, which I take to be the kind of philosophy which does the history of ideas as the doing of philosophy, but with a deep eye to reality, including political reality around him. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by the translator of these three volumes, Carlo Lancellotti, who's professor of mathematics at the College of Staten Island, which is one of the campuses of the City University of New York, as well as a professor of physics at the graduate faculty at CUNY. He earned degrees in physics, engineering physics, and applied mathematics, first at the University of Milan and then at the University of Virginia, and has published widely in a variety of academic journals related to physics and the applied maths. Professor Lancellotti will be speaking for about 20 minutes. I'll then ask a few questions that I have from my reading of the book, and then I'll moderate questions from you, the audience. This is a webinar, so members of the audience won't ever be visible or identified, but you can submit questions at any time throughout the webinar, however you would like, by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, and those questions will be fed to me, and then I can moderate them on. And you can begin submitting those questions whenever you would like. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and special thanks to you, Carlo, for finding time to articulate the problem of atheism to us. Thanks so much.
Oh, no, thank you, RJ. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm always happy to talk about Del Noce. Yeah, this book took some work. And as you said, it's not the easiest Del Noce work. It is his most famous, and it was his first book. It was published back in 1964. And if you ask an educated Italian about a book by Del Noce, they will probably cite The Problem of Atheism because he kind of made his name and is still reprinted. But honestly, it's not the first book I would read. And so for that reason, it's not the first book I translated, because it is very rich, very long, and sometimes dense, like the Noce can be. And the structure is peculiar. And I tried to explain in the introduction that Del Noce was given the opportunity to publish a collection of essays of his work in 62, 63. And what he decided was to give a snapshot of his intellectual career, of his intellectual experience. And so it's really, he describes it as a collection of compressed books. It's not like one book, but it's like 4 books mashed together to mark the steps of his intellectual trajectory, so to speak. So in that sense, as a model of scholarly organization, it didn't work, but very well. But at the same time, it really has a wealth of material. And essentially, the Noce selected 6 essays, and then he was asked to write a brief introduction. And then, as the story goes, he disappeared for 1 year, and then his desperate editor cornered him and forced him to wrap up. And he came back with another book, because the introduction was 212 pages, while the 6 essays he selected were 360 pages. So essentially what he did, being a very intense, very always in evolution, I was a thinker that kind of never settled for a system. Del Noce was always searching in some sense. And so he decided that the 6 essays needed to be revisited. And so he revisited a lot of topics from the 6 essays and wrote a new book as an introduction to the 6 essays. So many well-intentioned readers have started reading this 212 pages introduction, and it's hard. So in the introduction to the book, I tried to explain that it's better to start reading the essays and then go back and see what he corrected, what he changed, what he commented in the new introduction. But the introduction is hard to understand without reading first the essays that it's trying to revisit, so to speak. Anyway, so to understand the topic of the book, the 6 essays gives you a better idea. The first 2 are on Marxism, and they are the oldest, some of the oldest published work by Del Noce. They date back to 1946 and 1948. And Del Noce always regarded them as his best work. He was only 36 at the time, in his late 30s. But it was really the discovery of Marx as a philosopher that for him was important, because at the time there was the attempt at building the so-called Catholic communist movement, or Christian left, which was predicated on the idea that essentially Marxism is a social theory, or a science of history, or a political economy. And Del Noce, in order to see if this was feasible, studied Marx and discovered that Marx is a philosopher, which represents what he calls the first post-Christian anthropology, the first post-Christian theory of man. Man as not as a relationship with the transcendent, not as a religious creature, but man as a social creature, as a creature which is totally determined by the means of production, by material factors, by the economy. And then in these 2 essays, Del Noce goes in great depth discussing the nature of Marxism as a philosophy that, by its very nature, in order to be radically atheistic, has to transmogrify into politics. Okay? There is this idea that atheism is intrinsically political, and that in fact, political atheism is ultimately totalitarian, right? So this was where it was a life-changing realization for Del Noce, who had sympathies for the Christian left as a young man. And so this is why the first 2 essays are on this topic, on the philosophy of Marx. The philosophy of Marx as a type, as the type of modern post-Enlightenment, not scientific atheism, but positive, revolutionary, political atheism. Then after that, there is 2 essays on atheism more generally, not just Marxism, but atheism in history, starting with the libertines at the time of the Renaissance, the end of the Renaissance, then the atheists of the Enlightenment, then Marx again, and Nietzsche. These two essays were written very much in response to Maritain, because Maritain wrote a book on atheism. In English is called The Significance of Contemporary Atheism. If you translate the French, I don't know if the title was translated that way, but Maritain basically had this idea that atheism ultimately is a response to the failures of bourgeois Christianity. Because of the hypocrisy of bourgeois Christianity, people embrace atheism as a protestation, as a reaction against a corrupt form of Christianity. And as you can imagine, Del Noce disagrees exactly because he thinks that atheism, as typified by Marxism and then other forms, is not just anti-clericalism, which he discusses then in the introduction, but it is an original philosophical position that makes certain assumptions about the human condition that have to be taken seriously. They cannot just be discarded. Then the fifth essay is very long and very original, but also very hard to read. And it is basically a synthetic review in over 100 pages of Del Noce's reading of modern philosophy, not modern philosophy in general, but the philosophy, what he calls the philosophy of the Counter-Reformation. The authors he has in mind are Descartes, Pascal, Malebranche, Vico. This was because at the time of Del Noce, the way secularism and especially Marxism justified itself was by claiming to be the inevitable, logical outcome of the trajectory of modern philosophy. Right? This is an argument that you can still find today from time to time. The idea that secularism incarnates the direction of history and the direction of thought. Right? The idea that we cannot go back to previous forms of thought because they have been refuted, and secularism justifies itself as the fulfillment of a historical dynamic which is unstoppable, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so Del Noce, and typically the beginning of this secular trajectory is found in Descartes. Still today, I think, even in the US, very often. And so Del Noce discusses modern philosophy, and he discusses why, in his opinion, this view is oversimplified, because Descartes was the beginning of secularism in a sense, but it was also the beginning of French spiritualism, or it was also the beginning of, in a sense, of Christian existentialism. Del Noce thinks that there is in some ways a link between Descartes and Pascal, which are usually considered antipodal, opposite thinkers. And so in order to refute this self-justification of atheism as the inevitable endpoint of European thought, Del Noce claims that there is a second line of development in European thought that doesn't go from Descartes to Marx to Nietzsche, but goes from Descartes to Pascal, and then ends up in Rosmini and in Neo-Thomism, Gilson. But Del Noce was very interested in the Italian philosopher Rosmini, which he saw as the one who started to heal the philosophical troubles that marred late Middle Age theology and philosophy, and then the Counter-Reformation. Anyway, so Del Noce claims there are two lines of development in modern philosophy, one that goes towards nihilism and one that goes towards a restoration of metaphysical transcendent thought. And that's the subject of this essay, which is very interesting, but again, not easy to read. And then in the last essay in the collection, he talks about atheism and theism from a political perspective. And essentially he makes the association between atheism and totalitarianism, or between atheism and perfectism. An atheist must affirm that there is no limit to human perfectibility, and so politically must generate what called perfectist or perfectionist political movements who don't pose limits to politics. While on the contrary, a Christian political perspective or a theistic political perspective must inevitably, in some sense, recognize the consequences of original sin, or anyway, the mysterious limitation of the human experience. And Del Noce associate this recognition of the limit in politics with the liberalism, although in the European sense, the word liberalism has a rather different meaning than the American sense. And even Del Noce would probably not call himself a liberal in a strict sense of secular liberals. He was a very Catholic author, but he recognizes that the long-term political trajectory of Christianity is towards an affirmation of the dimension of freedom for theological reasons, because essentially grace has to be accepted freely, and so there is the inviolable sphere of conscience. And in politics, he believes that this must necessarily lead to non-totalitarian outcomes. And that's the last essay. Then, once you get this, then you can go back and read the 200-page introduction in which he revisits different topics that he felt he did not develop enough, things that he got wrong, that he wants to correct. He has a smorgasbord of material. Some of it is fascinating. I want to add one more thing. In the two essays on atheism, one I mentioned was a response to Maritain. The other is very remarkable, so I want to say a couple of words. It's called Notes on Western Religion, and it is the first essay in which Del Noce realizes that the Western affluent society of the 1960s was producing a new form of atheism. Because, he says that early after the Second World War, there was an opposition between Christianity and atheism. But then, around in the early 60s, the West developed an atheistic answer to communism, which he calls the affluent society, or in other works calls it the society of well-being, or this technological society, which was deeply irreligious. And maybe we can talk about that if you want later, but he has a sense that the West was born around in the late 50s, early 60s, what we still call today the West, and that in its response to Marxism, it accepted Marxist atheism and made it more radical. So this is what makes this essay, Notes on Western Religion, very thought-provoking. Anyway, so this is a quick review of the book. I don't want to spend too much time. RJ, is that good enough to start?
Great, thanks, Carlo. Yeah, so I have a few questions I hope we can explore, and those who are watching at home, please do start to submit your questions. It's the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on that, questions will get sent to me, and I can ask them. So, Carlo, can you explain to me the details, or can you amplify for us what I take to be part of, certainly not the whole, of the broad thrust of his account of how we get from rationalism to Marxism and atheism of a certain sort? So I understand him to make the argument that rationalism begins with the claim that there can't be a supernatural. We're stuck in the world of immanence, and thus reason is stuck within the world of immanence. Mm-hmm. But part of that claim then is a claim about the Christian conception of the fall, right? So it's not that rationalism is merely articulating the conditions of knowledge, but it's making a positive claim about the meaning of the fall, and that the end point of that rationalism is atheism and Marxism, or Marxist atheism of a certain sort. Of course, the Marxism is not what we in America tend to think of Marxism, right? His analysis here is not merely about economic pressures and means of production. I can't think that he mentions that anywhere really in the book.
No, never.
And the atheism that he has at the end point of rationalism is, of course, not merely unbelief. It's not the sort of Bertrand Russell way of, well, I added up all the evidence and it just wasn't there, so I don't believe in God. It seems to have this deep moralism to it of a purification or a critique of the idols of human absolutes. So we get from rationalism as a kind of immanence to late stage atheism or Marxist atheism, which is this moralistic refusal to participate in what they take to be the idols of human certainty. Can you amplify that for me? What's going on there?
Well, that's exactly right, although I would qualify a little bit the last thing you said. But to go back to the first thing you said, yes, Del Noce believes that the trajectory of secularization did not start from the negation of God, but from the negation of sin, from the negation of original sin. The way he phrases it, he says that a rationalist believes that there is nothing abnormal about the human condition, that the situation we find ourselves, there is nothing missing, there is nothing wrong, that basically death is normal. And it develops this idea, he recognizes it, and then he sees how it marches toward denying God as a consequence of affirming the self-sufficiency of man. Because I mean, to say that everything is normal means that we don't need to be saved, right? We don't need salvation because everything is under control. Everything is the way it should be. The real is rational and the rational is real. You know, the famous sentence by Hegel. So in this sense, this claim of self-sufficiency is more radical than the negation of God as a theoretical construct. And I'm happy you cited Bertrand Russell, because this really shows how, in some sense, continental atheism was more radical than Anglo atheism, in my opinion. Because, you know, if you look at Bertrand Russell, he's a perfect example of a guy who does not have a ton of metaphysical depth. He accepts the question of God. And then he says no on what Del Noce would call scientific ground. Del Noce says that the atheism of the 19th century was scientific because it accepted the question of God that says, no, we are what we eat, we have biology, we have evolution, we don't need a creator, right? But this does not take an anthropological tack, an anthropological twist. You know, it is just scientific. It's about, we talk about God the way we can. Yeah, we talk about God like we could talk about the Yeti. Does the Yeti exist? No, the Yeti does not exist. I mean, it was a fairy tale or something like that. Well, to Del Noce, if you study Hegel, for example, and then Marx, because to Del Noce, Marx is a Hegelian. I mean, in spite of all the story about turning Hegel upside down, you know, that Engels said about Marx, to Del Noce, is an Hegelian, precisely in the sense that Hegel, coming after Spinoza, coming after the old rationalistic tradition, affirmed essentially that God must be denied as a postulate to affirm human freedom. And Del Noce likes to quote this passage from the Marxist manuscripts of 1844, where he says that if we are created, we are dependent. If we are created, we cannot be free. And so the negation of God is really a consequence of the affirmation of the radical self-sufficiency and independence of man, creator of himself through work, through the dynamics of history, and so on and so forth. So you see that then for him, atheism also takes a gnosiological aspect, that there is no universal reason, because the Platonic logos is kind of a proxy for God, if you know what I mean. So you have to deny the logos too. You have to reduce reason itself to a pure instrumental reason, right? Rationality itself must be reduced to instrumental rationality. Rationality, like we have hammers and screwdrivers, we also have ideas, and we can use these ideas instrumentally to humanize the world, to make the world in our image and likeness, because we are God in a sense, right? Now, going to the last thing that I want to qualify, the moralism is ultimately what it takes in according to Noce, both in Hegel and Marx, a Gnostic tinge, where by Gnosticism, it means that if you deny original sin, then the root of evil must be individuality. Right? If you deny original sin, the root of evil is when the individual sets himself in opposition to the collective, right? And so there is this idea, in a sense, that we have to return. So the original sin was this separation. And so the moral dimension of atheism, according to Del Noce, is this remelting of the individual with all the religious questions, the existential drama. Life is not normal. There is something wrong with me. There is something missing. There is something that doesn't click. that has to be destroyed. Like a good Hegelian, you have to elevate yourself to the idea, to the universal spirit. You have to forget yourself and become one drop in the great river of Hegelian history, right? Now, of course, Marx makes big changes to the Hegelian picture. He makes it materialistic, he makes it revolutionary, but to the Noce, Marx never lost this Hegelian Gnostic tinge of eliminating the individual into the universal as the fundamental atheistic ascesis. Is that the word? Ascetic morality. You see what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So if you read the first part of your answer, the sort of the idea that freedom can't stand there being a God. And so part of the purification in the name of freedom or rationalism is to remove God from the picture. Not in the Bertrand Russell way, where we just add up the evidence and conclude, guess he's not there, like the Yeti isn't there.
Right.
But we have this more fundamental denial of the question itself, or even there's a lovely line in the book where God is to disappear without a trace, right? The question itself disappears. You might expect that that would lead to a complete turn to the individual, right? So in the name of freedom, we're going to remove God from the picture so as to be free. But it's very strange then that we also are going to remove the individual. If we remove God from the picture, we're also going to lose the individual. Say a little more about that, because I imagine that's counterintuitive to a lot of people.
Well, I mean, that's one of the great contradiction of Marxism, you know, in a sense, you know, that there is this idea that the individual must disappear. But then, as a Maritain already had accused, you replace the god of Sinai with the god of history. History itself becomes a very brutal divinity. And so there is obviously a contradiction. But the deeper contradiction that the Noce already captures, already in this book, is that ultimately Marxism, because of this contradiction, was going to help the affirmation of a more bourgeois, more individualistic culture. And this is the essay on Western religion, in which he claims that, you know, the what today we call neoliberal, but he calls it neo-bourgeois, neo-capitalistic West of that started taking place in the 50s and 60s, and which is still today with us. Was not able to criticize Marxism, accepted Marxist materialism, accepted the implicit relativism, because, you know, without transcendence, basically everything is relative to the historical circumstances. But because of this contradiction that I mentioned, ultimately the individualists came back. You know, Marx expected that after the revolution, people would come to a common, unified, collective awareness, consciousness, right? That there would be the socialist man. The socialist man would be post-individualistic, would be harmonic, would be fused in a universal harmony. And what we got was very different, you know, and that the Noce really felt very strongly that Marx is, by criticizing religion, by criticizing liberal education, by criticizing the traditional European and also North American structures that more or less had been informed by Christianity, by doing the pars destruens, you know, the destructive job, the destructive part of the work, really helped the growth of a new, more ruthless form of individualistic capitalism. And I think that really points at the philosophical level, reflects what you said, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, in the other books, and I saw it once referred to here, he calls that the decomposition of Marxism, right? Where its negative critique of bourgeois value in the end makes it powerless to fight what we would now call neoliberalism.
Yeah, because I mean, Marxism in a sense was a gamble on history. History was going to bring about the new world in which the individualism would disappear and people would become social creatures, you know, like a human ant, if you want, you know, like. And it just didn't. So Marxism as a philosophy bet everything on an historical outcome, and the historical outcome was not realized. And so to the Noce, as a philosophical punishment, Marxists got the opposite of what Marx intended.
Can I follow up with asking more about the individual? So the loss of God is also, in a sense, the loss of the individual as the locus point of the drama of existence.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested to see how favorably he talks about Marcel's criticism of atheism, not only for the metaphysics that Marcel does, the argument here, but also because the turn to the individual, the drama of life, brings God back into the picture. A section of the book which I found difficult, and I imagine many other readers would as well, is the importance and role of Pascal, of existentialism, and then ontologism. When I learned ontologism meant a heresy which followed if you thought that in your ideas you knew the ideas of God directly, such that you knew the essence of God directly.
Mm-hmm.
That's clearly not what Del Noce means by ontologism, and he indicates his usage is not the sort of old Thomistic usage. Can you explain a little more? I'll give the summary of how I read it, and then you can fill in for everyone, if you wouldn't mind. For Pascal, we have this important figure in Pascal, who finds the hidden God, or doesn't find the hidden God, right? God is always the one who hides himself, such that for Pascal and Del Noce's read, the non-existence of God is a real possibility, kind of front and center on your mind. God might not exist. God might not exist. And then in hope, or in the turn to value, as opposed to reason, because God's hidden from reason, one affirms the existence of God. That has some role for Del Noce to existentialism and to Kierkegaard. Something is not quite adequate there. And ontologism, particularly the world of Rosmini, where we have, as he puts it, a philosophy not of the hiddenness of God, but the presence of God comes to light. Can you explain what's happening there for me?
To some extent, but no, these are difficult questions, and I don't claim to fully understand everything myself. But I think Del Noce's point about Pascal is not so much that God may not exist, but that God faith cannot be just based on the metaphysical proofs. And he believes that this was true even for Aquinas, because he thinks that even in Aquinas was not trying to convince the atheists, he was trying to convince the Gentiles. And so he makes a certain distinction there that I will not try to illuminate. But Del Noce thinks that the experience of faith is the Christian knowledge of God is not the same as a metaphysical proof. And so, and this was Pascal's criticism of Descartes and other. So to him, the question is that there is one of the most fascinating sections in the book, in the introduction, when he talks about the three possible meaning of empiricism, right? And I'm not going to go there, but just to mention the third. The third is that we can have some experience of the transcendent, right? Now, I suppose that you have to contrast this with the Thomistic purely negative theology, right? I mean, the purely negative is that we cannot say anything about God except negative, right? To Del Noce, ontology that is not the heresy. It means a more Augustinian approach, or at least an attempt to reconcile Augustinianism and Thomism by introducing the possibility of an experience of the transcendent, which is a very modern theme. I don't know if you think of the Lubac and the natural desire to see God. That there is something in us which, as a perception of the transcendent, of the mystery, we are able to recognize the mystery, even if we cannot say anything about it, but we have a sense of God. I think this attempt to break the impasse between Augustinianism and Thomism is what he means by ontology, right? To the two Scylla and Charybdis, the two possible extremes are a form of rationalistic Thomism, in which you rely on this very sophisticated formal proofs of the existence of God, separated from religious experience, or a kind of irrational existentialism in which there is this unique, irrepeatable experience of God that cannot be in a sense, linked back to metaphysical reason and to rationality. And so to him, that's the tragedy of modern Christian thought, or the drama, at least, of modern Christian thought, that had this oscillation between the two, between rationalism. Think of the Spanish scholastics, think of some of the thinkers of the Counter-Reformation, this kind of more rationalistic approach, or the existential mystical approach. And Del Noce thinks that the task of modern Christian thought after the Reformation is to overcome this chasm, this chasm between Augustinianism and Thomism, between rationalism and existentialism. And this is what he calls the ontologistic project. He kind of gave up on the word, right? If you read his later works, he doesn't use it anymore. He was using it a lot in the 60s for his own development of thought. Later on, if there is an author that he recognized as, to him, the best embodiment of this attempt at reconciling Augustine and Thomas, would be Gilson, right? And so, in a sense, the young Del Noce's ontologism became Gilsonianism, if you want, precisely because in Gilson there is both Augustine and Thomas, and sometimes the theology of Gilson is called existential Thomism, precisely for that reason. You know more about this than me, probably.
It is interesting.
That's my understanding.
In what are the later books, but translated first, he talks about classical metaphysics and realism, which I was then somewhat, not really surprised, but surprised, I guess, to see how sharply he critiques or finds almost irrelevant the cosmological point of view for dealing with God. The 5 waves of Thomas, rationalistic.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really talk about them. It doesn't really talk about them. Keep in mind that again, he likes Rosmini. Rosmini is a Thomist. I mean, there is a bit of Scottism there, but Rosmini tries to develop Thomas in modern language. The Thomism that Del Noce criticizes is the Jesuit Roman school of the 19th century, which are also the people who got Rosmini condemned. What's called manualistic. Is that the word? Manualistic Thomism.
The tradition of Suarez, right, is not
right. But then in the 19th century version, there is a rather now forgotten Italian guy named Father Liberatore. There was a whole school of thought that, in a sense, was kind of understand pretty rationalistic in their approach, and so Del Noce, that's what he's kind of responding to, I believe.
He says the cosmological point of view is less helpful than what he calls interiority, which is religion in spirit and truth, because there's the presence of God. There's a generative experience. Okay, we got a bunch of questions that are being sent in, so they're in no particular order. So we may bounce around a little bit in terms of theme. But one question that came in is why is the affluent society anti-Christian? In the book, I don't know what the Italian would be, but as I remember, you translate it as the affluent society is non-Christianizable even. So why is the affluent society so anti-Christian?
Well, remember that to Del Noce, the big divide is anthropological. Whether to be human is to be relationship with the transcendent and participate in the Logos. It's not even about Christianity. He calls it Platonism in the broadest sense. Whether ultimately there is an invisible world of ideas, values. There is justice. There is truth. There is beauty. There is the world of the transcendentals, and we can relate to it through some sort of what he calls intellectual intuition, again, which is a kind of Rosminian word, or the Marxist view, which is that we are social creatures. We are ultimately social creatures, and ideas don't have any transcendent grasp. They don't grasp the eternal. Justice is what society makes justice to be, and goodness. The transcendentals, justice, goodness, and beauty are reduced to sociological explanations. Now, where does the affluent society fall on that divide? to Del Noce, it obviously falls on the sociologistic side. I mean, he thinks that there is not even a question, that ultimately it's not Marxist, but it accepts a certain atheistic anthropology which Marx pioneered. Again, as you said very correctly before, he doesn't give a fig about Marx as a political economist. To Del Noce, Marx is a metaphysician, right, or maybe more precisely a philosophical anthropologist, somebody who develops a philosophical anthropology. And he claims that the philosophical anthropology of the African society is not particularly different from Marx. It's post-Marxist. He tries to refute Marxism because the African society formed itself in opposition to Marxism during the Cold War, right? But it develops a view. It implicitly, he says, he failed to criticize the Marxist vision of man, and so became subordinate, in some sense, to Marxism as a philosophy, not as an economic political theory, but as a philosophy. So that's the challenge. Is it true that the African society is ultimately radically irreligious in that sense, or not? Del Noce would say so, even if it lets people to go to church and and whatever. But it determines that anyway, the religious questions are irrelevant to the life of society as such.
There's two questions that come from viewers, both of which apply to what you just said. So the affluent society, in a sense, becomes subordinate to Marxism because it lacks the ability to critique the Marxist view of the human, the philosophical anthropology. One of the questions that's asked is, most of us don't know what's going on with the Marxists. We know that there's leftists out there. But the question is, how would we apply Del Noce's reasoning to the contemporary Marxist world, let's say broadly influenced by Marx, when they're not actually Marxists in the thoroughgoing sense? They don't have the political economy. They don't have concerns about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in the sense that Marx does. Is there still a Marxism now? And if so, if not, what do we learn from Del Noce? And if so, what does it look like?
Well, again, Marxism as a political economic theory is been dead for a while, but there is also something that makes Marx a philosopher, which I tried to briefly describe earlier. And the Noce thinks that this kind of more philosophical Marxism, even if people don't read Marx, was a type. The word type, was the type of what he calls positive atheism. A positive atheist is an atheist who does not care to deny God because he's hell-bent on changing the world. The 11th is on fire, right? Philosophers so far try to comprehend the world while the point is to change it, right? Now, if you take that as the new type of atheism that Marx has inaugurated, an atheist that does not care to deny God theoretically, scientifically, because he wants to deny it practically through politics, wants to deny God by showing the self-sufficiency of man, the normality of the human condition, the fact that we can change the world. If you take that Marx as the pioneer aspect of Marx, it's very much out there. I mean, you can see there, just turn on TV and you can, or go to a university and you will find it. Now, should we call it Marxist? Well, we don't have to call it Marxist. A lot of people don't read Marx anymore, even, I agree. But we should recognize that there is a philosophy, that there is a theology there, that there is an anthropology, which happened to be pioneered by the atheists of the 19th century, Marx, and in a different way also Nietzsche, because they're kind of complementary. So, when we have these political religions, right, like we see today, people that implicitly affirm that the salvation of mankind will come from politics, well, you don't have to call it Marxist if you don't want it, but it's pretty recognizably an extension of what was the Marxist worldview. That's all the Noce would claim, and so that was the success of Marx in that sense.
And for Del Noce, the really interesting part of Marx, right? That's what's still alive. The
Absolutely,
interesting part
yes.
of Marx. Yeah.
Yeah.
A question which is related to that. So, if we have an atheistic choice of freedom rather than a choice for God, is there, or what was the specific theoretical basis for choosing freedom over God? Does Del Noce explain that?
It's let me make a qualification there. Del Noce thinks that the choice for the Marxist atheistic choice is for non-dependency, not to be dependent. But it doesn't use the word freedom. It uses the word liberation. Okay, it says that that's one of the interesting passages in the book, that from a Marxist perspective, freedom must be replaced by liberation. What is the difference? Well, that freedom is an analog of the Augustinian relationship with God, in a sense that we are capable of God, we are hungry for God, and we can be satisfied by God. And so the word freedom could be a political translation in some sense, in various ways that I'm not going to try to discuss, of the affirmation of the irreducibility, in a sense, of the individual in relationship with God. Liberation, by contrast, is the removal of the social oppressive structures, right? Rousseau. I mean, man is good, man is normal. There is nothing wrong with us. It's a sort of political Pelagianism, if you want. There is nothing wrong with us, except that society keeps us down. Now, if I want a society to stop keeping me down, it's not just going to be to liberate me. I have to liberate everybody. Yeah, and then you have all these categories based on race, gender, this and that they don't use the word freedom. They use the word liberation as removal of oppression, removal of oppressive social structure. So you see that in Marxism, the word freedom doesn't really belong. But the word liberation belongs in this sense of removal of oppressive social structure of certain groups against some other groups. But it's still the funny thing, though, is that it is individualistic, because ultimately what unifies freedom from a more Christian or classic perspective is the participation in logos. We are all made in the image of God. We all participate in the logos. We are unified at an ideal level by sharing in the transcendentals, if you want. In Marxism, this is impossible. There is no transcendent dimension that you and I share that unifies us. So what unifies us is that my liberation requires your liberation, and your liberation requires my liberation. Now, you see how the individualism that Marx was trying to push out of the window, out of the door, comes back through the window, because ultimately, if there was a way to get my liberation without your liberation, I wouldn't get it. you know what I mean? And so then we go back to the reason why this neo-Marxist movement, if you want to call them neo-Marxists, are ultimately so bourgeois. I mean, because they ultimately expect that by removing the oppression of this and that, everybody will be a happy sexual or whatever economic consumer, but there is no society. In a deeper sense, there is no society, because there is no logos, there is no ideal. And so the liberation can only destroy, but cannot build, right? You can remove these supposed oppressive social structures, but then when you want to create a society, there is nothing.
Yeah, it's all negative critique. It doesn't build.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the sense of unification, of social unification.
Yeah, it can't provide what we might think of as genuine solidarity.
Exactly.
It's interesting if we think about liberation rather than freedom, and the articulation of how that leads to liberation from oppressive structures, as opposed to freedom understood as the individual participating with the logos, and thus also as a person being committed and involved with others. Does that transition from freedom to liberation also explain in part why we see crisis of liberalism right now, that liberalism is increasingly questioned and doesn't know what to do with itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't like to use the word liberalism because it means it's such an elastic term. You know, it can mean many different things. There is the classic American liberalism, which is a sort of kind of moderate secular progressivism that started early in the 20th century, which has been justly criticized for a million reasons. There is, the romantic European liberalism of the 19th century. There is the liberalism of, Hannah Arendt could be considered a liberal in some sense, meaning liberalism is anti-totalitarianism. People who want to oppose totalitarian regime, they often call themselves liberals. So the word is very hard to use as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there are people who are bolder than me and they use it, but I try to be very prudent because it means many different things.
Okay.
Having said that, Del Noce thinks that if you think of liberalism in its earlier forms, like classical economic leaders like Adam Smith or the laissez-faire libertarianism, that kind of thing, which was kind of the first thing that called itself liberal, Marxism had a valid critique. The fact that well, I don't need to go there. That what the Marxist critique of liberalism. But the question is that what the Noce says, if liberalism wants to reaffirm itself in a positive sense after the Marxist critique, has to become religious. I mean, that's his perspective, because you have to recuperate freedom, and freedom again involves participation in the good. The participation in the logos, in justice. You cannot have a form of liberalism based just on neutrality, right? On denying metaphysics. A liberalism without metaphysics is going to yield, to give way to Marxism, or if not Marxism, to some replacement of Marxism that proposes a positive, at least apparently, a revolution, a change, a rebellion against oppressive structures that will always win against a neutralistic, metaphysically neutral liberalism. I think that's what he thinks.
Yeah, so I mean, it really is, his thought really is deeply Augustinian on that point. If by freedom we mean liberty or libertas, that's already pointing us to something like the freedom of the logos as revealed by God, or as reason understands it to be. It's pretty thoroughgoing in its thickness, isn't it? That's not merely freedom of indifference. I can choose.
Yeah, he also mentions the old theology of grace. The Christian theology of grace. Grace can only be accepted freely. If it is not accepted freely, it's not accepted. So in some of his youthful political writings, which maybe will be translated at some point, he says that the discovery of the modern age is the age of the expansion of atheism, which is the negative side, but is also the age in which Christian thought discovered the proper nature of freedom as the way in which truth is accepted as such.
Yeah.
Right. That's his definition of freedom. Freedom is the way in which truth is accepted as such. If it is not accepted truly, it's not accepted as truth either.
Right.
And he thinks that this theological dynamic politically is the only possible foundation of a healthy form of liberalism, whatever that means.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, that leads to the next question that someone sent in. So you mentioned earlier that for Del Noce, political atheism is necessarily totalitarian. Could you explain?
Well, to him, it's an equation. I mean, totalitarianism is just a different name of political atheism. But just remember that for him, atheism, again, is not a theoretical, abstract denial of the
Yeti.
big ghost of the Yeti or whatever. For him, atheism is the affirmation of the radical self-sufficiency and of man and the normality of the human condition, the fact that there is no original sin, that we are in control, right? So if we are in control, there is no limit to politics. You see what I mean?
Politics.
Yeah, politics becomes total, because if we make the world, if we are the creators, if we are the makers of the world, politics becomes total. Okay, simple as that. It can be more benign. You can have concentration camps in the Gestapo, or you can have CNN. I just say CNN to say some.
That's where the bumper sticker, Carlo. Look, you can have concentration camps or this news channel.
No, I mean, say other forms of control, other forms of political control. I mean, the secret police and the concentration camp is a rather crude form of political control. But politics becomes, in a sense, everything, absorbs everything. Ethics is absorbed into politics. Art is absorbed into politics. The way you do healthcare is absorbed into politics, because politics is just the expression of man, the creator, right?
So it's rooted to what he would call elsewhere technological rationality, right? We can control it.
But then that's where technological rationality gets out of control, because Del Noce is not anti-technology at all. He doesn't think that technology is the source of the problem. He thinks that the problem warps technology, and meaning that he thinks that if you have this metaphysical background, this Gnostic metaphysical background of, affirming the denying the individual and affirming the self-sufficiency of man, then technology and science become ideological tools, become where you hope to use the handmaid of politics, right? The Noce says that atheism expresses itself in two ways: politicism and scientism. He says that in the Problem of Atheism somewhere. That these are the two typical expressions of atheism: are politicism, the supremacy of politics, or scientism, the absolutization of science. And then around page 450 something, he asks which one takes priority, and he says politicism. In his opinion, scientism is important, but it is subordinate to politicism, and I think he's correct.
Right. Yeah, good. Because again, we're not talking about the old understanding of atheism where somehow science disproves God or science replaces God. Yeah, good. That's helpful. I don't know if you know anything about Christopher Lasch, but a question is asked about the parallels that this reader sees between Lasch and Del Noce, about the linkage between affluent society, technological thought, and cultural liberation. They find it interesting that a European Catholic and American man of the left came to such similar conclusions about the 60s right and left. Do you know Lasch enough to say anything about that?
No, Lasch is on my reading list, but I don't know him well enough. I just read some short pieces. I have to read the books. But I will say this, that, that these trends have been going on for a while, and there are some differences between the US and Europe because of historical reasons. But by and large, the world we live in is still the world that took form after World War II, not immediately, maybe started taking form when the old generation passed away. The generation who was young during the war became prominent. And then this generation formed the generation of 1968, and so by 1970, it's the war we are in. I mean, the war, I would argue that historical epochs are kind of questionable, relative, you can argue. But if there is anything like an epoch that we are living through, maybe coming close to the end, certainly it is an epoch that started in Del Noce and Lasch's time. And so it's kind of understandable that intelligent people would have been the first to see it. I mean, that's all I can say.
Well, this may be an awkward segue to the next question, but Lasch wrote The Culture of Narcissism. So that my segue is to the next question. What would Del Noce think of contemporary identity politics?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he died in 1989. I think he would say that atheism, and he says this about Marxism, but it holds in general, has to affirm itself politically through ideological myths, because the nature of ideology is culture as a political tool, right? The difference between ideology and philosophy is that philosophy searches the truth, ideology seeks power. Okay, philosophy seeks the truth, and ideology seeks power. So Del Noce would be critical because he would think that this identity politics is often just ideological. I mean, it's a theory that is forced upon a complex reality because people are complicated. They're not defined by limited factors, or they're not defined by these simplistic groups that we try to force them in. The fact that we try to replace a realistic view of mankind with these oversimplified categories of identities and so forth is ideological, is a tool for power. It's done to seek power. And I think that Del Noce would claim that the only answer to it is not a counter ideology, because there is also the counter ideology, but it would be really to raise again the question of truth. Del Noce was hoping for, at some point, a religious revival, but religious revival is not just pietistic or moralistic. It is fundamentally a return to the search for God, you know, and I don't know, maybe this seems tangential, but I think it has to do with identity politics.
Well, I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface of the book, and there's a lot more questions, but our time is nearly up. Carlo, what final comments would you want to make about Del Noce to people viewing?
Well, maybe one thing that has been striking me recently about Del Noce is that Noce was not a man of simple formulas. He was trying to keep all the factors into the picture, and he was always searching. To the end of his life, he was not satisfied with the simple package which I can use to. I mean, he was a faithful Catholic, but he thought that the task of every Christian in every age is to rediscover the tradition, to make the tradition living again by showing that the tradition answers the new questions that we face, that people did not face before. And so we have to discover aspects of the tradition that people did not notice before because they did not face the same questions. You know, it's like the scribe in the gospel that has his chest and he finds new things and good things. I think that Noce is exemplary of a man who searched for the truth and searched for a truth that was not abstract, but was an answer to the situation that we face while staying faithful to the essence of the tradition. I think that's the lesson that I learned from Del Noce. And I will say that if anybody here has never read Del Noce, this book should not be the first book you read, as you said at the beginning, because it is rich and complicated and complex. I will start from the first volumes. But if you read the first two, I think you would find interesting stuff in this one as well.
We've been talking about Augusto Del Noce's The Problem of Atheism, recently translated by Carlo Lancellotti, who's with us this evening, and released by McGill Queen's University Press. It is not the one with which to begin, but also translated by Carlo and also released by McGill Queen's would be The Crisis of Modernity, which my own recommendation would be this is the one to begin with, although it's no easy read either. These are serious books, which will take some time, but merit study. That's from 2014. You can look at Carlo's translation of the age of secularization from 2017. This has been a webinar by the Public Discourse, the Journal of the Witherspoon Institute. We hope you read us online. We remain committed to calm, sober, reasonable discussions about the things that matter, and we hope that you read us at thepublicdiscourse.com. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and Carlo, thank you so much for joining us, and indeed for all of your really invaluable work at translating.
Thank you, RJ. It was great.
Thanks everyone. See you soon.